Most of you will know the famous film, The Celebration by Thomas Vinterberg. It's a father's 60th birthday, and his son says he has two speeches, a positive and a negative one. And then he picks the negative one and tells his family that his father has sexually abused him when he was a boy. I also have two speeches about the Cochrane collaboration, a positive and a negative one. And the positive one is about the first 19 years, and the negative one about the last 6 years. We are named after Archie Cochrane, who was a Scottish epidemiologist that drew attention to our collective ignorance about the effects of healthcare. And his little book from '72 is still very well worth reading. In 1992, the first Cochrane Centre in the world opened in Oxford in the UK, and a review group called the Pregnancy and Childbirth Group was registered, and then came the Subfertility Group. So if you couldn't get pregnant, you could get help from the Subfertility Group, and soon afterwards came the Neonatal Group, so that you could be taken care of when you had given childbirth. Now, a year later, the Cochrane collaboration was launched, and 3 Cochrane centers were established at the same time, one in Canada, one in the US, and one here in Copenhagen. Now, 25 years later, 3 of the 53 review groups are based in Denmark, here in Copenhagen, and the Nordic Cochrane Center has saved Danish taxpayers more than 500 million Danish crowns annually over many years, based on just 3 of our reviews, and these are the reviews about mammography screening, alpha-1 antitrypsin for lung disease, and health checks. In 2012, a new CEO was employed. He is a journalist by education, and his special interests are the Soviet Union and the Balkans. He talks a lot about brand, our product, business. I can't remember when he last used the word science. He practices micromanagement, and the Cochrane centers are greatly dissatisfied about this because they ensure their own funding, and then they give something to the Cochrane collaboration. They don't expect to be managed. They expect to be independent. Last year, I decided to do something about the course of travel in Cochrane, which I and many others believed was wrong. I got elected to the governing board with most votes of all 11 candidates, despite the fact that I was the only one who had dared criticize the Cochrane leadership in my election statement. Usually, if you do that, you do not get elected. 1.5 years later, I was expelled from the governing board and from the whole Cochrane collaboration after I had been exonerated by Cochrane's own hired law firm from all charges raised against me. And these charges were related to petty issues with the spokesperson policy. This was a genuine show trial. I was exonerated, but new charges were invented on the spot. What was all this really about? I had demonstrated serious mismanagement on part of the co-chairs of the board and the CEO and his staff. They had introduced scientific censorship. Don't criticize Cochrane reviews, particularly not our prestigious HPV vaccines review. We know a lot about the HPV vaccines because we have access to the clinical study reports from the European Medicines Agency. Our criticism was very warranted. Don't attack our dogmas, please. Cochrane does not want to disturb the drug industry, guilt interest, particularly not those of the psychiatrists, and society at large, the establishment. So these were the reasons I was expelled. There were several, as you can see. So what were the results of my expulsion? David Hammerstein, one of the 4 Cochrane Governing Board members who resigned in protest after the unwarranted expulsion of me, he was a former member of the European Parliament for Spain. He has headed large consumer organizations and is currently the director of the Commons Network. David Hammerstein wrote in an article that the big winner in this conflict has been the pharmaceutical industry. Having succeeded in weakening the voice of one of its greatest critics and having consolidated a Cochrane leadership closer to industrial interest with fewer audible critical voices. His article is a masterpiece, well worth reading. The CEO and the board has harmed Cochrane's reputation immensely, and they continue to do so. There has been widespread condemnation of Cochrane processes and its many mendacious statements about the reasons for my expulsion. After the CEO took control of our website secretly behind our backs, I had had enough and withdrew the Nordic Cochrane Center from the Cochrane collaboration. The German and the French Cochrane centers have also had enough, so they are withdrawing too, and they will become centers for evidence-based medicine instead of Cochrane centers. This spring, the US Cochrane Center closed completely after having been harassed throughout 2 years by the CEO of Cochrane, Mark Wilson. So it seems that the Cochrane collaboration is disintegrating currently. All 31 Cochrane directors from Spain and Latin America have signed a document which describes the lack of transparency, accountability, and due processes, and proposes the establishment of an independent ad hoc commission that should review all actions related to the conflict. In my 25 years with Cochrane, I cannot remember a single time where only 5 center directors could agree on anything. We are very different and come from different parts of the world, but here they all agreed that this is not right. It needs to be redone. You might say that in Latin America, they recognize a dictatorship when they see one. As is characteristic of the current Cochrane leadership, it has ignored the letter. They are out of touch with their members, and they are out of touch with reality. There was a big uproar in the international literature over this. In Science, Nature, the BMJ Cochrane director says his sacking was flawed and came after a show trial, which is certainly true. In Le Monde, Lancet, and other good places. The Lancet wrote that I think that the collaboration is becoming increasingly centralized and commercialized, that the executive team has authoritarian tendencies, and that certain policies are not fit for purpose, particularly the spokesperson policy. 1 year ago, I pointed out at a meeting of the governing board that it was totally unacceptable that up to half of the authors on a Cochrane review can have direct financial conflicts of interest related to the manufacturers of the product they are reviewing. I wrote a new draft of the policy. It took me a few hours in an afternoon. That was a year ago, but absolutely no meaningful action has been taken. It seems to me that Cochrane is not interested in having the drug industry at arm's length. Ian Chalmers, who created Cochrane, when he invited 50 people 25 years ago, including me, he wrote that the purpose of the first Cochrane colloquium will be to launch the Cochrane collaboration formally as a truly international collaboration, committed to opposing any tendency for it to become dominated by any nation, institution, or individual. So what do we have now, 25 years later? In 2012, Cochrane's new CEO, Mark Wilson, quickly threw out collaboration from the registered charity name, Cochrane Collaboration, to the great chagrin of Ian Chalmers and senior leaders in Cochrane, because collaboration is really what characterizes us. Academics usually compete fiercely. We don't. We collaborate. We try to be generous. We are kind and friendly. It's very different. This year, 21 of 53 Cochrane review groups are based in the UK. 4 of the 6 remaining governing board members, after 4 members resigned in protest over my unjustified expulsion, they are from the UK. Co-chair Martin Burton is also the UK Cochrane Centre Director, and in daily life, he has Mark Wilson as his line manager. This is a huge conflict of interest that should not be accepted in any organization. If Martin Burton doesn't do as his boss pleases in his role as co-chair, he might get into trouble. Wilson effectively controls the governing board and everything else in Cochrane. So you can see we now know not only have Cochrane collaboration dominated by a nation, the United Kingdom, but by one single individual, 100% opposite of what was Ian Chalmers' vision 25 years ago. So what does Cochrane need to get out of this mess? Read the brilliant analysis by David Hammerstein on my website, search for 10 October B, and read my complaint to the Charity Commission about serious mismanagement of the Cochrane collaboration. We need a totally new leadership and governing board, refocus on our values: collaboration, openness, transparency, accountability, democracy, generosity, independence from industry and guild interests, no scientific censorship, but academic freedom, no tolerance when review groups abuse their power. We submitted a criticism of a Cochrane review of Ritalin for ADHD. It took 18 months before it was published as part of the review, and our criticism and that of others led to the review being withdrawn. It was of very poor quality. Sometimes relevant criticism never make it to become part of the Cochrane review. This is not okay. We need much simpler and quicker Cochrane reviews. Instead of hundreds of pages that builds on poor industry-sponsored trials that we cannot trust, some Cochrane reviews could take up just a few pages telling people we don't know what is the case here because the trials are so poor and flawed that we cannot draw any conclusions. We also need Cochrane reviews based on clinical study reports, which you will hear more about later today. We have produced some groundbreaking results based on these study reports we have acquired from the European Medicines Agency. They can take up thousands of pages for just one trial, and you can see things there, particularly when it comes to harms that are totally impossible to see in the published trial reports. The harms are simply not there. Tom Jefferson, who will speak later today, has said about trusted evidence, which is the Cochrane motto, that when we have Cochrane reviews of biased, ghost-ridden, cherry-picked, industry-sponsored drug trials, they come with a nice little Cochrane logo. But that cannot change the reality that garbage in is garbage out. Tom was quoted in an interesting read, an article by Marianne Dimasi, one of our researchers, from Sydney in Australia, Cochrane, a sinking ship. Thank you.